the mood is certainly in Jerusalem very positive, and I did see plenty of footage of people out and about in Tel Aviv, maybe not always wisely and according to home front regulations yesterday, but I did see people, and I think we're going to see us starting the education system. No, schools will still be closed, but I think we're going to start seeing certainly businesses and other places of business, restaurants and the like, starting reopening now.
Absolutely. I mean, in Tel Aviv, we saw over the weekend coffee shops, restaurants all open. We saw people going about shopping, sitting in restaurants all throughout the weekend. And tomorrow, of course, workplaces are expected to reopen. But, some people are saying, is it too soon? Because we still are seeing this trickle of rocket fire. And of course, schools are not yet reopening. I mean, what do you make of this? And I think overall, at least in Tel Aviv, in Tel Aviv, go ahead.
There is an element of risk, Ladar. I get the point, and I'm not underplaying it. But part of the strategy of Iran, not just with Israel, but we see it in their attacks on, for example, the Gulf states. We see it, their attacks on other countries, has been the fact that they know they can't win a war. They can't even win on militarily. So their strategy is to just make the war costly in terms of the amount of military firepower the United States and to some degree Israel has to use, but also costly in terms of the economies of these countries. I mean, I think the attacks particularly, there's no coincidence that what are they hitting in Dubai and Abu Dhabi? They're hitting hotels, direct hits on hotels. They're hitting the civilian airports. They're not just the U.S. Bases. They're trying to, part of their strategy is to disrupt the economies, certainly of Israel, of the U.S. indirectly by targeting the price of oil and the flow of oil and natural gas through the states of Hormuz, and of course targeting the economies of the Gulf countries. And I think that's why it is important for the Israeli economy to start to sort of come out of its shell, even while there is some degree of risk involved.
Absolutely. Kalev Ben David, thank you so much for giving us an update at this hour, and we'll, of course, come back to you later in the broadcast, so stay with us.
Right.
And for those just joining in, I understand we may have had some technical issues here on our YouTube channel, so I do just want to give a quick recap once again. It's been 1 week today since Operation Roaring Lion and Operation Epic Fury began with joint U.S. and Israeli strikes on the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since the onset of the operation, the United States and Israel have targeted the regime's senior leadership, including the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and some 40 senior IRGC and regime officials. And Israel on Friday released footage of 50 fighter jets striking the underground compound of the Ayatollah. These are the images you're seeing on the screen right now. The strikes are also continuing to target the remaining nuclear sites and capabilities following on the damage inflicted in Operation Midnight Hammer in June of 2025. And the strikes have also hit the regime's ballistic missile industry, with Secretary of War Pete Hegseth saying on Thursday that Iran's ballistic missile attacks have decreased by 90% since day one. Iran's navy has also been decimated, with over 42 ships destroyed as of Saturday, and Iran's terror proxies throughout the region are also being targeted and their capabilities diminished, as well as that of the internal repression forces used by the regime against the Iranian people. And the unprecedented U.S.-Israeli cooperation is continuing in full force. On Saturday, videos released show thick plumes of smoke rising from different areas of Tehran today as loud explosions rocked the capital. And over the weekend, the IDF also targeted Tehran's international airport, saying it destroyed 16 aircraft used by the IRGC, Quds Force. The army said the airport was being used by the IRGC as a central hub for arming and funding the regime's terror proxies across the Middle East. U.S. President Donald Trump has promised on Friday that there will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. And incoming missiles. Meanwhile, despite the joint U.S. and Israeli strikes, the Islamic regime is continuing to fire missiles into Israeli territory on Saturday. There have been 8 missile launches at Israel since midnight last night from Iran, sending millions into bomb shelters in the middle of the night. And throughout the day, on Saturday. So far, no casualties or major damages have been reported. And amid the massive U.S. and Israeli strikes, the Islamic regime in Iran has announced that it will stop firing missiles at its Arab neighbors. So far, since the beginning of the war, the regime has fired at 13 different countries throughout the Middle East and Europe. Iran's president made a statement today. He said, "We didn't intend to violate neighboring countries. As I've said many times, they are our brothers." He added the decision was made and communicated to the armed forces that from now on, they will not attack neighboring countries or fire missiles unless those countries attack Iran. Brothers, and yet the Islamic regime fired hundreds of missiles at their so-called brothers this past week, and not just at U.S. bases. They targeted civilian and economic infrastructure in these countries, from five-star hotels in Dubai to the airport in Kuwait to the oil fields in Saudi Arabia. U.S. President Donald Trump replied to the statement in a post on his Truth Social on Saturday. The president said that Iran, which is being beat to hell, has apologized and surrendered to its Middle East neighbors and promised that it will not shoot at them anymore. This promise was only made because of the relentless U.S. and Israeli attack. He added that Iran's goal was to take over and rule the Middle East, and it is the first time that Iran has lost to surrounding Middle Eastern countries, claiming these countries have thanked President Trump. He added that today Iran will be hit very hard, including, he said, areas and groups of people that were not considered for targeting up until this moment in time. And so joining us now with the latest on Operation Roaring Lion on day 8 is Colonel Rich Outzen, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Rich, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So we're seeing unprecedented victories by the United States and Israel over the Islamic Republic of Iran. How would you assess the war 1 week in?
Well, I think it's too soon to draw any broad conclusions beyond the tactical. Obviously, Israel and the United States, from the perspective of naval and air operations, intelligence, have provided a virtuoso performance, right? The ability to track over not just months, but years, command and control patterns, infrastructure for the ballistic missiles and so forth, and to develop a very sophisticated targeting plan and to execute it with some patience. And we're seeing the results, again, with the degradation of the ballistic missile capabilities and the command and control capabilities. That's why, for instance, the Iranians themselves weren't sure why their forces were shooting at neighboring countries, at the neighboring Arab countries. But warfare is a funny thing, and you can be tactically an A+ and still be strategically a C or even an F. And that's the real question here. This all has to do with war aims and what are we ultimately getting to beyond the operational level. Now, Secretary of War Hegseth has said that the three main things operationally that we want to do are to degrade the residual nuclear capabilities, the ballistic missile capabilities, and to destroy the Iranian Navy. There's a lot of other things going along with that. But what is the political end state that follows that? As Clausewitz and other famous military strategists have said for a long time, all the destruction, all the effective killing of the enemy really amounts to very little if you don't achieve a political change and some sort of a better status quo in terms of your national interest. And this is where I think the Trump administration is open to some criticism, and this is what we hear in the U.S. What is it that you're actually going for? Is it the overthrow of the Iranian regime? He's denied that, and yet he's also said some things that indicate that's the goal. At the same time, it may be, and I think this is probably most realistic, that he wants to thread the needle a la Venezuela and find somebody who's the Delcy Rodriguez in this scenario, somebody who's still of and in the regime, but far more willing to play ball, so to speak, with American interests, threats, and demands. That lack of clarity has led to some challenges from the left and from the right in the Congress. The most recent attempt to enforce the War Powers Act and limit the ability to continue the fighting was defeated because, among other things, John Fetterman, a Democratic senator, voted with the Republicans. But there's some significant concern. And I think the longer this goes on, the more this question of, okay, A plus tactically, but where are we headed strategically? Are you going to fail in the end to achieve substantive change? Are you just kicking the can down the road again? That question is going to loom large. And I can't really give you an assessment of the strategic outcomes until we see another week or two of this playing out. And in the meantime, again, top marks for the technical prowess.
So you brought up a lot of really interesting points there, and I want to kind of break it down. You know, first of all, we talked about the sort of the end goal or the strategic aims of this war. So let's break that down for a minute. We have, as you mentioned, the nuclear, the ballistic missiles, the Navy, the terror proxies. Where are we now on each of those issues, each of those arenas?
Well, I think the naval part's the easiest, right? Because it's very hard. The build time for ships is very, very long. And the ability to reconstitute even fairly small vessels, it's not great, right? So the fact that we have sunk apparently 42 Iranian ships, people use the word decimate quite a bit. Decimate technically means killing 10%, 1 out of every 10. We've gone far beyond decimation of the Iranian Navy. I think that the way it's been done, sort of some cases with sort of the newer weapons and precision-guided munitions, in some cases very old school with the sinking of a ship by a submarine shooting a torpedo, has been wide-ranging and sophisticated. I think it's going to take decades until Iran can reconstitute naval capacity, and that impacts them diplomatically. It impacts their ability to spread mischief in other hemispheres. So I think that is the most advanced of the war aims. The ballistic missiles, again, the Israeli and American pilots day and night are going after launch and production facilities. I think that but see, the problem there is it's a little easier to rebuild your missile capabilities. So I'll give us a high mark, but not quite as high as the effects that we've gotten with the Navy. We'll say it's going back to the American academic grading system, an A on destroying the Navy. I'll give it a B on degrading the ballistic missile capability. Now, on the nuclear file, it's interesting. Of course, last year,
I want to stop you for a minute and talk a little bit about the ballistic missile as well, because, you know, we are still seeing that trickle of missiles here in Israel. And so, you know, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said that there was a 90% reduction in Iran's ballistic missile launches since day one. Do you think that's an accurate assessment? I mean, what is your analysis on that?
Yeah, I do. I think this is following sort of a similar trajectory to what we've seen in Israel's past wars with Hezbollah, for instance, right? Where they, in the early days, they're trying to save some, not launching everything at once, but a significant portion and an impressive array of missiles and rockets. I was in Israel in 2006 during that war and you know, saw the fires in the Galilee. That can be very impressive and have a political and psychological effect. But you're using up your inventory. And I think we've reached a similar state now in this current war. I think Iran has exhausted a fairly significant amount of the launchers and missiles that it has. And more to the point, unlike 2006, there's a much more aggressive, much more effective campaign to go after the production sites and the infrastructure. So I agree with Secretary Hegseth on this. I think they've probably used up close to 90% of their surviving inventory. In Iran, they'll continue to shoot 1s and 2s, 3s and 8s if they can, to continue to say we're still fighting, we're still resisting. But let's keep in mind that these are really an irritant and a psychological form of warfare. They're not hitting and destroying things of much value. The case of the American soldiers that were killed in the Gulf, that was actually a drone from what I understand. Now, of course, the Beit Shemesh effect, as you referred to earlier, it doesn't take more than 1 or 2 stray missiles to get through and get lucky hits. So it's not that there is not still a threat, but in military terms, in strategic terms, the ballistic program right now is a non-factor. It's not going to enable Iran to win this war, and it's not going to enable them to knock out significant U.S. or Israeli military assets. It's another terror tool. So that's how I view in the net the ballistic program and the effects against it.
And what about the nuclear capabilities? I mean, that was really the main reason that U.S. President Donald Trump gave for going to war. We heard his envoy, Steve Witkoff, say that the Iranians were boasting they had enough material to create 11 nuclear bombs just before the strikes began. So where are we on that front?
Well, that's harder to tell, right? I think after the last year's attacks, there was an indication that we had not destroyed, obviously, the entire stockpiles. And Where they took the residual amounts, that's an open question. I'm sure that, sort of like with the old scud hunting in the Saddam Hussein days, we've got people on the ground and satellites everywhere trying to track the fissile material. But then again, that is fairly easy to reconstitute if you've got the centrifuges intact. So I think in this case, to get, and I'll give us a C with regards to the nuclear program, not because we're not striking important targets and damaging that program, but until you have regime change, and this is where the regime change really becomes an important question, until you have a government in Iran that says, you know what, we really don't need nuclear weapons, and we're willing to work with a formula where we keep the uranium under inspection that's used for nuclear power, and that's all right, and that's fine. I think most of the West and even Israel, with the right safeguards in place, would be okay with Iranian nuclear power. But as Witkoff, and it was fascinating, his interview with Mark Levin, and I think he said some other remarks as well. The Iranians made very clear they were happy to have had enough fissile material for 11 bombs. And that's why we have to continue this. I'm no big fan of regime change wars, and I'm very sympathetic to the arguments that the U.S. should not get involved with extended wars in the Middle East, especially not to change regime. This has to come from the people. But until this issue is resolved, the fact that we still have a regime that calls death to America, death to Israel, great Satan, lesser Satan, and is proud of the fact that they have the fissile material, we have to sustain the war until it's impossible for them to mate that fissile material with ballistic missiles, because that is simply a strategic threat of the first order. And at the end of the day, Democrats and others, the people on the far right, even in the U.S. who are critical of this war, have no answer to that. That we'll never get beyond a C in terms of effectiveness against the nuclear program unless we have either a controllable regime, something like the Delcy Rodriguez model in Venezuela that's also open to inspections, or a new regime. And as unsavory as that is, it's far better than having a Iranian mullah regime that survives this and says, look, it's because of the nukes that we're still here. Then you have the North Korea scenario, where they basically are incorrigible and a threat to their immediate neighbors, but we can't go in because they've got the launchable nukes.
Absolutely. And the United States and Israel certainly are unwilling to get to that model. Donald Trump has only intensified his rhetoric today. In fact, he's calling for unconditional surrender. So, considering everything that you've just laid out, what's your assessment of this demand? How likely is it that the United States and Israel will be able to achieve such a victory?
Yeah, unconditional surrender is that's a tough ask, right? All of these asks are tough, and I was in the region, obviously not in Iran, but in some neighboring countries about a week ago, and talking with some senior leaders in the area. That there's broad skepticism that the regime can actually give us on all three things, all key asks, the ballistic missiles, the nuclear program, and the proxies, give us everything they want and still survive. Because if they were to say, okay, unconditionally we surrender, we're giving up the nukes, now what? Well, they've also just lost their deterrent terroristic ability vis-a-vis their own people. Because one of the reasons they're still in power, the Islamic Republic, is because they've shown the people we have nukes, we have the ability to threaten outside powers. They can't come help you, and we will kill 30,000 of you in 3 days if you try to overthrow us. The day that regime says, okay, that's it, the game's up, we're taking too much of a beating, we quit, I think the chances for regime change become much greater from within, not from without. So that's why I think that it's very, very hard for the mullahs to do that. This is essentially a race between three outcomes, in my view. The first is what I call the Delcy Rodriguez model, where we've inflicted, even though President Trump is saying unconditional surrender, he's a negotiator, right? He's a businessman. If he demands that and then is offered something like, say one of the people that's in jail, one of the opposition, there are some people that, was it Hossein Mir? I'm trying to remember the names.
Well, there's also, of course, the Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, who seems to be sort of the front runner or the choice of the majority of Iranians. He's ready. He said he's ready to go in for a transitional government.
Yeah, there's some skepticism in the U.S. about how much traction he has in the country, right? But somebody like that, let's just say that some political figure that's seen as not necessarily tied to the current, the very hardline Khamenei wing that's been running the country for the last 15, 20 years, somebody more akin to the moderates that we had in the early 2000s. If they bring someone like that forward and they say yes to inspections and yes to verified no nuke weapons program, then I think that the demands that Trump has made get the middle compromise coming out. And that's the best that can be hoped for. And many of these countries in the region, by the way, are hoping for that. Because if, let's say, the Islamic regime collapses, like President Trump referred to in his Truth Social post, well, the problem then is that you don't really have somebody that's ready to take over. If the state's no longer intact, its coercive arms are no longer intact, its economy's in shambles, and you get a Pahlavi who has not been in the country for decades and frankly has no experience running a state. You then, there's some other forces like the NCRI, National Council for the Resistance in Iran. But again, that's more of a diaspora organization, and they have some intelligence assets in countries, but there's nobody that can run that country. So the best thing to do is to get that just enough pain so that a moderate is put up there who can make compromises rather than dissolution of the state. Because as attractive as that sounds in the abstract, right, starting over from a tabula rasa with an entirely new government, an entire new state, there be dragons there. There's a ton of bad things that can happen to the Iranian people and to the neighbors if there's sort of a chaos and an interregnum that comes about after a absolute surrender or unconditional surrender. And by the way, we're not going to send troops to occupy and stabilize. Israel's not going to send troops to occupy and stabilize. It's almost preferable to have sort of a husk of the current regime, just with some new faces and some new thinking at the top.
So certainly still more to come in this war. One weekend, Colonel Rich Outzen, thank you so much for joining us for this special live broadcast.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to bring on Tal Inbar. He's a senior research fellow at the Missile Defense Advocacy Alliance and an expert on Iran's ballistic missile program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
So we're 1 week into the war, and as we've just heard from Colonel Outzen, it's going well for Israel and the United States, but there's still work to be done. And so I do want to hear from you specifically about the ballistic missile program, which seems to be right now still a threat to the state of Israel and to the countries in the region. What is the state now, after a week of strikes, of Iran's ballistic missile program?
Well, we can see that the rate of fire was declined dramatically from the first day, and we see the trend is continuing. But having said that, the Iranian regime still have the capability of launching missiles, and just today we have several missile attacks on Israel and, of course, on Iran's closer neighbors. So there is still the potential of launching missile, and it could be for the next couple of days or perhaps weeks. Nevertheless, the more attacks from the U.S. and from Israel and strikes, we can see that most of the launch vehicles themselves are being destroyed, either before the launch or right after the launch. So this is a critical point for Iran, because even if, for example, they will still have a stockpile of more than 1,000 missiles, but without the launchers, they cannot use them.
And you said there's a reduction in missile launches from Iran, but here in Israel, it doesn't necessarily feel like that. I mean, we saw continued missile salvos being thrown mainly at Israel now. The focus has, of course, shifted to Israel. We've had 8 salvos since midnight last night and counting. So how much longer can this reality last? I mean, how much more capabilities does the regime have to continue launching missiles at its neighbors and at Israel?
So first, we have to difference to make the clear that there is a difference between the use of the word salvo than what we saw today. For example, we saw today in Israel several missiles were fired, but one at a time. So this is not a salvo. This is something that like harassment, like the Houthis did when they fired on Israel. How much longer it could last, it depends on the amount of U.S. and Israeli strikes, because we have, of course, established an air superiority over Iranian skies, and the hunt for the launch vehicles and the hitting on the subterranean missile bases, like Iran called them, the missile cities, is always continuing. So we can see that some capabilities are left for Iran, and the plain and simple answer that is that we don't know for how much longer Iran could do it. It could be for days or even longer.
And we are hearing reports that on the basis that some of the senior regime officials have abandoned their posts, that there are IRG officials and army officials that are essentially abandoning their posts and running away. I mean, what can you tell us about that and its impact on the ballistic missile program?
Well, from day one, or from the early morning last week, the first strikes on Iranian high command, many of IRGC commanders, including those commanding the firing of ballistic missiles, were eliminated at the first minutes of the offensive. So it also had some weight, but then again, at a, let's say, at a base level, like a base commander of a missile unit, he could decide, I think, for himself to continue to launch the missiles that there are in its arsenal. So it doesn't necessarily true that you have to get a centralized command to decide, well, let's now launch some missiles to Bahrain and now Kuwait and now Abu Dhabi and now Israel. So they are firing what they can. And we see that at least in the last few days, they cannot coordinate a large barrage of missiles against Israel, at least, because it is more easy to launch missiles on the Gulf countries because the range is much shorter, and they can use solid propelled ballistic missiles, which are smaller, easy to hide, and not so complicated to prepare. If you compare it, let's say, for the Horm Shah 4, which is a heavy missile with more than 2,000 kilometers range, but it takes a lot of time to prepare it for launch.
Mm-hmm. And as we're speaking, I'm receiving a report of a launch from the Islamic regime of Iran heading to northern Israel. They've received sirens, or a pre-siren as we receive here in Israel, and there's about a few minutes until the siren sounds and those missiles make their way over here into Israel. And you mentioned the Gulf countries. That's very interesting that after sort of pounding them with missiles for the past week, the regime has suddenly changed course, announcing that it's not going to be firing at its brothers. Is this, do you believe, because it realized its strategy was backfiring, or because Iran is simply running out of missiles and capabilities, and so they want to turn all their focus to Israel?
I think that we shouldn't pay too much attention to the declarations from Iran's President Pezeshkian about, well, we don't want to fire on our brothers or close neighbors. We're just aiming to the U.S. bases and assets in the region. That's for sure not true, because I'm not aware of any U.S. military installations inside Dubai's hotels, for example. So this is just some empty words. I think that the UAE, for example, could take possession of all Iranian money in UAE banks, and this will hurt Iran a lot. So I think it's just something that was said to, let's say, to ease a little bit the tension between the region, the GCC countries and Iran.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Tal Inbal, thank you so much for joining us today on this special live broadcast.
Thank you.
And it's not just the Islamic Republic of Iran. Over the weekend, Israel continued strikes against Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, with just this past hour, the IDF issuing evacuation orders for Beirut's southern suburbs, a Hezbollah stronghold, warning residents of upcoming strikes against the terror group. Over the weekend, the IDF struck Hezbollah rocket launchers, weapons depots, military strongholds, and other terror infrastructure throughout southern Lebanon. Defense Minister Israel Katz issued a statement warning the government of Lebanon it would pay a heavy price if it continues to allow Hezbollah to launch strikes into Israel. Let's hear what he had to say.
אנחנו לא נאפשר לחיזבאללה לפעול מתוך כל התשתיות של שטח לבנון כדי לפגוע באזרחים, לפגוע בחיילים, ולכן אם לא תאכפו ואם הברירה תהיה הגנת אזרחינו ושלום חיילינו או מדינת לבנון, אנחנו נבחר בהגנה על אזרחינו ועל חיילינו, וממשלת לבנון ולבנון ישלמו מחיר כבד ביותר.
And at this hour, we've also just received a report. We'll get back to Hezbollah and Lebanon in a moment, but we've just received a report. The censor has approved its publication at this hour that the designated heir of the Islamic regime, Khamenei's son, was injured in a strike, but is apparently still alive. So they tried to eliminate him, but so far he has managed to escape the Israeli and American strikes. And back to Lebanon, the IDF announced today that as part of its activities in Lebanon, IDF special forces operated overnight in an attempt to locate findings related to the missing navigator Ron Arad, who was captured about 40 years ago in Lebanon. No findings related to him were located at the search site, and no IDF injuries were reported, this according to the army. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also issued a statement, said that bringing him home is a commitment of the state of Israel as well as a personal commitment, and the IDF also said it will continue with this mission until all of the fallen and the missing are back home in Israel. And so joining us now with more on Hezbollah's involvement in the war, as well as the other Iranian terror proxies, are Dr. Eric Mandel, founder and director of MEPIN, and Dr. Eyal Pinko, intelligence, cyber, and security expert. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So, yeah, let's start with you. You know, Hezbollah was largely decimated in the past 2 years of fighting with Israel, but we're seeing it come back into this war despite the ceasefire. What are its capabilities today?
So during the last, let's say, half a year since the other war finished, as we are in a war between war all the time. So since then, Hezbollah force was built up using Iranian Quds force with large amounts of missiles, rockets from different types. So Hezbollah was, I think, is prepared for battle as we see that now. And I think the Israeli operation that is being conducted now to clear once again, unfortunately, the southern part of Lebanon is showing that is full of capable, and only today a few soldiers were hit by yesterday by Hezbollah anti-tank missiles. So they are in not as they were 1 year or 2 years ago, but they're still in power.
Absolutely. And I just want to pause for 1 second to let our viewers know that at this hour there are sirens in the north of Israel, in the Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee at this hour. So millions in bomb shelters in the north of Israel at this moment. Dr. Mandel, turning to you, we see that Israel is holding, and here we see the siren, the red dots indicating every area where a siren is sending people into bomb shelters. So Dr. Mandel, back to you. We see that Israel is holding the government of Lebanon directly accountable for Hezbollah's actions. We know that the government of Lebanon has failed to uphold its end of the ceasefire by disarming Hezbollah. What is your assessment on this front?
Morgan Ortagus, who is one of our representatives in Lebanon, made it clear to the Lebanese government that not only UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which said there has to be no Hezbollah activity below the Litani River, but also the Security Council Resolution 1559, which means there has to be only one force in Lebanon. That means Hezbollah in nowhere in the country. But this goes up against a reality. Almost half the country is Shiite. Maybe more than half of the Lebanese armed forces are Shia. We know that there is, in fact, the Alma Research and Education Center has reported on Hezbollah infiltration within the Lebanese armed forces. And we're not sure even if the Lebanese government is willing, are they capable of getting the Lebanese armed forces to disarm Hezbollah? This is an amazing golden opportunity for Israel without any American restraint to totally degrade Hezbollah. Hezbollah, remember, according to ILTV, follows the orders of the supreme leader, whichever the supreme leader is now, and is really an arm of Iran. And they joined, even if it was counterproductive, maybe to their survival interests. But Lebanon is still going to be a failed state unless Hezbollah can get so degraded, and possibly all the groups within Lebanon who are not Shia, Sunni and Druze and Christian could come together. But I don't see that really happening. So you just need to create a quieter border. I think Iran may be a different story in killing that head of the octopus there, which gave $1 billion, according to my State Department, in 2025 to keep Hezbollah going.
And Eyal, so are we looking at an upcoming ground invasion of Lebanon, since it seems that the Lebanese army, the Lebanese government are unable to disarm Hezbollah and send them north of the Litani River?
Yeah, I'm pretty well connected for what my colleague said here. As we know that I was an intelligence officer for many years, and I can tell you that we knew, and still we know, that the Lebanese military officers, during the day they are officers, and during the night they are Hezbollah. So, and with this force, which is being equipped with equipment from Germany, France, the US, and other countries, they are military with good capabilities, but without any kind of capability to impose Hezbollah to dismantle Hezbollah. So as it is like that, and with the U.S. ultimatum towards the Lebanese government, which is, we see, very incapable, I don't see any kind of other solution than some kind of Israeli military maneuver inside the southern of Lebanon in order to, once again, to clean again and again Hezbollah cells that are already there.
So I just want to stop for a minute and give a quick update on the missile that was launched from Iran. This was apparently a joint coordinated attack between the Islamic Republic and Hezbollah, who also launched at the same time missiles, rockets from Lebanon. The rockets from Lebanon were intercepted. Both rockets and the missile from Iran landed in an open area. And we have reports that another missile is on its way, this time in the area of Tzfat or Safed in northern Israel. So we will continue to update, of course, on the incoming missile fire as it happens. So, Eric, we just heard from Eyal about Hezbollah and the Lebanese army, and sort of what he said, that they're soldiers by day, Hezbollah by night. Eric, I do want to ask you about the U.S. stance. I mean, would the United States be on board with Israel going into Lebanon to dismantle Hezbollah once and for all? We know that the U.S. mediated the ceasefire. President Trump did not want the war to continue, but now that they're going after the head of the octopus, as you said, and Hezbollah, of course, one of its tentacles, what is the U.S. position here?
Well, I think people don't realize that when Israel maneuvered in southern Lebanon, it really only went in a few kilometers. There were obviously lots of other operations south of Litani. It didn't go in with major forces. What I would, if I was telling my government of what to tell Israel, I would say the focus here has to be on Iran. And if we get distracted too much by Lebanon now, the great opportunity of dealing with Iran will be missed. I mean, we are in a situation where I have to say that Lebanon is secondary to Iran. We have a president who said just a short time time ago, from take your country back to the Iranian protesters to now unconditional surrender, Trump picking the next leader of Iran. So coordinating an endgame here in Iran and in conjunction also with what's going on in Lebanon is incredibly important. And I think people are also, I've been monitoring American TV analysts who are overly exuberant about whether it's operations in Iran or in Lebanon. And I want to tell them, and when I tell my government, don't confuse these tactical victories with an overall strategic success. And so we're dealing with air campaigns, one, to maybe get rid of a regime. Of course, there's cyber and other special ops that are going on. But the same thing in Lebanon. We don't want that government to fall. That's a real country. But it is primarily an air campaign to degrade them. And too much boots on the ground. You know, I have echoes of the first and second Lebanon wars in Israel. Israel cannot reoccupy and get caught up in Lebanon. It's got to keep its focus on Iran. And that is, to my mind, the best way to keep the president on board for not focusing on Hezbollah and letting Israel do whatever it needs to do there. Israel can go and be in two theaters at once, but obviously the military theater of Iran is much greater and in coordination with America. Israel is totally on its own in Lebanon and doesn't need any American help.
Eyal, do you agree with that assessment?
I think that Israel doesn't want to go into a large-scale operation in Lebanon or to stay in Lebanon, especially up to the Litani River. I don't think that the Israeli public and also the political leaders are willing to do that. But nevertheless, we cannot see that Hezbollah will stay on and live in the southern part of Lebanon. And you just, a few minutes ago, you just you mentioned that the last firing for what was a few minutes ago, it was coordination between Hezbollah and Iran. So as Israel is being surrendered by Hezbollah, Iran, we didn't speak yet about the Houthis that are still in quiet for some reason. Israel need to dismantle Hezbollah. It should be a strike or an operation that will be short in time, but and to come back to the Israeli borders as I see it for now.
And Eric, turning back to you, what about Hamas and Gaza? How is this war impacting everything that's happening in Gaza? I mean, Hamas is watching these developments unfold. They so far have refused to disarm. Are they next?
It's interesting. Everybody just a few weeks ago was preoccupied with the Board of Peace and the Palestinian technocrats coming in and all those things. And all of a sudden that is totally off the page. Remember, Hamas as Arab Sunni jihadists was in a marriage of shared interests with Persian Shiite Iran. So Hamas depended upon them, but they still will go. They are not going to give up. I don't see any choice when we get our focus back to Gaza that Israel eventually, the IDF, is going to have to go in itself if it wants to disarm. That means take away the 60,000 AK-47s, which are claiming to be defensive weapons, and to go get rid of the tunnel network that may still be tens, if not hundreds of miles that has been untouched, the demilitarization part. So we can't forget that. If Iran goes well, and if the war up north goes well, I think the president will give Israel much more leeway to do what it needs to do. But if those other theaters go south, and there's lots of American lives that are lost down the road, we haven't even talked about how. I guess let me just take one little step back. What could go wrong? We have Iran. What is their goal? They still want to delay everything to make this drag out. They eventually want to kill Americans to undermine domestic support, and they want to make Arab countries run out of interceptors. And we haven't even talked about sleeper cells. if all of those things, if we can manage all of those things, Israel dealing with Hamas is going to be a much better proposition. If those things go south and the president changes his mind, he doesn't pick a leader. Because just remember, when the president says Iran is over, it's over. Israel has to leave. He won't say that necessarily about Lebanon or Hamas. But if Israel and America are not perceived as winning in Iran, it affects what's going on in Hamas. And it's very simple. The regime says, and this is, they won't say it, but if they survive, Iran wins. If the regime falls, collapses, even if it's not regime change to the positive, that would be an American and Israeli win. But remember, America's not great at dealing with multiple theaters at once, understanding this more as checkers as opposed to five-dimensional chess, which the Israelis are very good at. And that is one of the important things that we've gotten out of here. America now refers to Israel as its model ally. And it is probably and it's no other nation in the world has been called a model ally by the United States. So this model ally, how much leeway will it have in Hamas with Lebanon and with Iran for how long until the president in a political season has to change his course?
So that is certainly the million-dollar question. Eyal, I want to turn to you to hear your assessment as well on how the war is impacting Hamas in Gaza and the potential sort of peace deal that President Trump hopes to bring forward to Gaza and to the region as a whole.
Yeah, first, just to mention that it's never boring in the Middle East. Every week we have something else. It's unbelievable. Yeah, and I absolutely agree with Eric. It's it's a multidimensional. We didn't speak about the 7 dimension of cyber. We didn't mention the disinformation. It's all around and all dimensions. So until Ania was taken down, Iran had a huge and significant impact on Hamas and the way that Hamas was acting. Since then, what is happening that Qatar is playing a very important part in Hamas role, and pretty much control Hamas, I will say. So I believe that once this war will end, and I hope with the Iranian regime collapse, I believe the next step will be to try to a little bit to dismantle Qatarian impact on Hamas and to see how really we can implement what President Trump started with this kind of committee. I don't know even how to call it really. It's some kind of hybrid autonomy model. So I believe it's too early to speak about, but I believe soon we'll go back to the table, starting to deal with how to implement this one. The issue here is that during this time, Hamas is taking the advantage of the attention that is being put on Iran, on Hezbollah, and is gaining force again, getting more armament through the Egyptian border, using Bedouins and other forces that are bringing him more weapons. And Israel is not doing anything about that, and which is, I believe, a big problem. It will be a big problem after that to dismantle them. This Western way of, I will say, romance approach of let's dismantle Hamas, it's only ideology. It will never happen, as I see that for now.
Dr. Eric Mandel and Dr. Eyal Pinko, as you said, never a dull moment here in the Middle East, and certainly so much more work that needs to be done. Thank you both for joining us this evening for this special broadcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And tomorrow, on Sunday, Israel is supposed to begin gradually reopening the country's airspace, paving way for outbound flights to begin. There are currently tens of thousands, around 40,000 tourists and foreigners were stuck in the country looking to make their way back home. Some left through Jordan and Egypt, but about 30,000 remain stranded. And so tomorrow, Israeli airlines will begin flying around 50 to 70 passengers per flight out of Israel, despite the missile attacks from both Lebanon and Iran, which are continuing. And not just the airport, as we heard at the top of the hour, tomorrow workplaces are expected to open for the first time since the start of the war. Children are not yet back in school, but they are back to school on Zoom. So joining us more with this is ILTV's Kalev Ben David. Kalev, you joined us at the top of the hour. We went through a lot covering the war with Iran, Hezbollah joining the war, home front commands, incoming missiles. I mean, so much happening here in Israel and the Middle East. You know, I just want to hear your thoughts wrapping up this hour of a live broadcast.
I just want to relate. We mentioned, you discussed earlier with some of the guests, this video that was put out earlier today by the president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, where he apologized for the attacks that Iran has done on its Gulf neighbors and says it won't happen again as long as they're not attacked by that. But yet, after he said that, first of all, just look at that video. It looks like it was done on a cell phone in somebody's basement. That gives you maybe some sense of the pressure the Iranian leadership is under. And further, we're getting pictures now, if you go on social media, of a missile attack this evening on Dubai, not on a military target. Dubai's not shooting at Iran. So obviously, despite what the president of Iran says, there are military elements, the IRGC, maybe part of the military, that are not listening to the president there. That shows
And right now we're seeing some of the visuals just from today, despite this comment.
That's right, hitting civilian airports and doing it. That shows you there is it's not just the ballistic missile program, the Iranian Navy, military forces, and it's what's left of its nuclear program, but the leadership is feeling the strain. Seems to be a breakdown in the leadership. You reported during this program, this report, that the wounded, the son of the supreme leader, who is designated as a successor by some, is wounded. Even if they would release that, if that information got out, it may be more serious than we know. So there is damage being done to the leadership of Iran. Now, where this is going to go, I don't know. I do want to say this. Even if this war were to end tomorrow or tonight, it was a win for Israel. Iran's ballistic missile program has been severely degraded. Clearly, Hezbollah has taken a serious blow. There's going to be a change in attitude toward Iran, surely among the Gulf states, countries like Qatar and Oman that were almost supportive of Iran. So even if this would end tomorrow, it would be a win for Israel. But the President Trump has made the stakes higher. He wants to see some kind of change in the leadership, and of course the Iranian people do. It's not clear yet if that goal is really achievable just by this air campaign, and that will remain the big question going forward.
Absolutely. Kalev Ben David, thank you so much for joining us and for your final thoughts this evening.
All right. I hope for a quiet night in Tel Aviv, Ladar.
As well in Jerusalem. And that is all the time we have on this special edition, this special wartime edition on ILTV. You can join us for live coverage out of Israel every hour on the hour on our social media channels. We will continue to update constantly with the latest updates out of Israel and the Middle East. I'm Ladar Gavelazi. Thank you so much for watching.
Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Emily Schrader, and coming up in today's newscast, U.S. and Israeli forces intensify bombing campaign against the Islamic Republic. U.S. Senate effort to block Trump's attacks on the regime fail in vote. Homefront Command eases work restrictions as rocket fire from Iran decreases. Day 6 of the war in Iran. The Air Force carried out a new wave of airstrikes overnight and today, hitting targets in Tehran and in western Iran. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz has the latest.
The IDF says Israeli Air Force jets struck multiple regime command centers and military facilities across the Iranian capital, including ballistic missile arrays, launchers, and air defense systems. Some of the missile launchers were hit while Iranian operators were preparing to fire toward Israel. The strikes also targeted a major compound housing key security agencies of the Iranian regime, including the headquarters of the Revolutionary Guard, the Basic Paramilitary Force, and the Quds Force. According to the IDF, Iranian intelligence, internal security command, and cyber warfare units were also struck. The military says it's targeting personnel responsible for planning attacks against Israel and for suppressing protests inside Iran. The army says it's dropped about 5,000 bombs on Iran since the war began last Saturday. Israeli strikes have also targeted ballistic missile infrastructure at their launch platforms at a facility in Isfahan. The IDF says more than 300 Iranian missile launchers have been destroyed or disabled so far in the campaign, part of a broader effort to reduce Iran's ability to fire missiles at Israel. A senior Israeli Air Force officer identified only as Colonel Aleph says